I should clarify a couple of points. And Jack, I'm amazed that you're allowing these to people to get off so lightly. Usually in Australia they pay $150 to come for a day seminar like this. And I see that I think it's about $15. And if you think at the end of the day that you've got more than what you paid for, I haven't been asked to say this, then why don't you do something for this church? Because they're the ones that allowed us to come. And it was interesting in Texas last week that we took 850 books along and every one of them sold. Now, they don't put another slice of bread on my table. I have 4 different organizations, on one in particular that I give all the royalties away. But I don't know whether you realize, but if you were to go to the major libraries of the world, you would find books on exotic subjects like the sex life of a butterfly, but never in the history of the world has there ever been a book written with principles and formulas on goal setting. Now, I know a few of you are saying, now that can't be right. Think of the name of the book. Try and think of one. I'm talking about a major work with formulas on goal setting. What really set me going was I was in South Africa and I gave a lecture on goal setting and I was offered $10,000 for my notes. And I thought, well, better I put this in a book. But we found in Dallas last week that some people were buying 10 books and getting them autographed for their friends and spreading them all over the place. It was interesting too to me that it's never ever been launched in Australia. We didn't get time to launch it and say we've come over here, but $62,000 worth of it was sold just by people hearing about it and coming into our real estate office. I was in a motel in Queensland, that's in the northern part of Australia, and I snuck out, just opened the door and looked at the paper so I could read it before I went down to breakfast, and suddenly I saw, this is one of the biggest newspapers in Australia, How to Reach Your Life Goals, taking up 1/3 of the front page, where the government had said that it has to go in every prison. And never in the history of Australia has that ever happened with a book before. On How to Be Happy Though Rich, it kind of blew us away because I sat down and wrote the thing in 40 hours, and that included revision. I wrote How to Reach Your Life Goals in 62 hours and How to Handle a Major Crisis in 38 hours, and I just do it all longhand. And when How to Be Happy Though Rich came out, it just hit the front pages of just about everything you could think of, and women's magazines did a couple of pages on it. The major newspapers, some of them did up to 3/4 of a page on it. And we're not a Christian country. We have been removed from the United Nations as a Christian country. And then the television came in, and the government television, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, came into our apartment in the early hours of the morning and spent all day with us and put it on prime time television showing a day in the life of Peter Daniels. And I was able to share with the people in our nation what God can do in a life that is challenged and changed. And so it's not an ego massage to me, but if you really want to help someone, then the comments I've had on those 2 books, maybe you'd like to take this opportunity, because you won't be getting them again, because they'll be any that are not left I'll take away with me, and they will not be launched in the United States for another probably couple of years. Now, at the end of some of the sessions today, I'm going to try and get a roving microphone and see if we can have a question time, and you can ask me anything. And boy, they generally do. I mean, I said at one time, you've asked me everything except the colour of my underpants, and they said, that's the next question. Diogenes sought with the lantern of the noontide in ancient Athens for a perfectly honest man, and he sought in vain. In the marketplace he once cried aloud, "O hear me, O men," and when the crowd gathered around him, he said it scornfully, "I call for men, not pygmies." And over the door of every profession, every occupation, every calling, the world has a standing advertisement, man wanted. Man wanted who will not lose his individuality in a crowd, a man who has the courage of his conviction, who is not afraid to say no, though all the world say yes. Man wanted who, though he is dominated by a mighty purpose, his manhood, he will not allow the overdevelopment of one faculty to stunt or to paralyze his other faculties. Man wanted who is larger than his calling, who consider it a low estimate of his occupation to value it merely as a means of getting a living. Man wanted who sees self-development, education and culture, discipline, character and manhood in his work. Man wanted of courage who is not a coward in any part of his nature, Man-wanted, who is well-balanced, who is not cursed with some little defect or weakness which cripples his usefulness and neutralizes his power. Man-wanted, who is symmetrical and not one-sided in his development, who has not sent all the energies of his being into one narrow speciality and allowed all the other branches of his life to wither and die. Man-wanted, who is broad and who does not take half view of things. A man who mixes common sense with his theories, who does not let a college education spoil him for practical everyday life. A man who prefers substance to show and one who regards his good name as a priceless treasure. Man-wanted, who is full of life and fire, whose passions are trained to heed a strong will, the servant of a tender conscience, who has learned to love all beauty, whether of nature or of art, to hate all violence and to respect others as himself. Man-wanted, who is educated all over, whose nerves are brought to a sharper sensibility, whose brain is cultured, keen, incisive, broad, whose hands are deft, whose eyes are alert, sensitive, microscopic, whose heart is tender, magnanimous and true. Ladies and gentlemen, the whole world is looking for a man or a woman like that. And although there are millions of us, it still seems almost impossible for us to find the right man or the right woman for almost any department of life. So everywhere, until you become that person, we will see the sign, man wanted. I want to talk to you for a while about handling a major crisis. I have had so many phone calls over the years. The phone calls always start the same. They say, Mr. Daniels, you don't know me, but... And then they go into a long, entangled story. Sometimes they break down and sob over the phone. Other times they're quite direct and decisive and abrupt. But always they're in trouble. And as I have counseled people throughout the world on how to handle a major financial crisis, I shared it with some people in Singapore. They said the government would be interested in that book because Singapore is having its first recession since Lee Kuan Yew took over. As I mentioned it to others around the world, people came over from London and said, we want that book. As I mentioned it to others in South Africa, they said, we want that book. And so very shortly it'll be going to print, and this will probably be the last time I'll ever talk on it because it'll be available for sale. And when I think of how to handle a major crisis, I think of my own crises. You see standing before you a successful, reasonably wealthy individual. But I went broke 3 times. I know what it's like to face some angry creditors. I know what it's like to think that there's only one way I can go, and that's up. All else is gone. I can remember at one time, the 3rd time I went broke, I was laying on a concrete floor, stripped to my underpants and spread out like Elijah. I was weeping, and I said a prayer. I said, oh Lord, I am so low I could walk under a snake's belly with an umbrella up and not even scratch his navel. And at that point, I suddenly realized that maybe some lessons had been learned. Maybe the education was over, and we didn't look back since. But I found some incredible truths in handling a major crisis, and I just want to share them with you during this time between now and midday when we stop for lunch, and then after lunch we might have some questions on anything that you might have on your mind. The first thing that I found that was important in handling a major crisis was your attitude. Your attitude is more important than facts, more relevant than circumstances, more powerful than opposition, more resilient than pressure, more flexible than time, more valuable than money, more influential than position, more forceful than the markets. In other words, watch your attitude because that will determine your altitude. And the first point that I want to leave you, if you have a major financial or other crisis, is remove the imagery. You see, what happens as soon as you get pressure on, you get all these images coming into your mind, and they'll take you off on a tangent, and you need to get your worst known facts and fears down on paper. And preferably, I suggest you get a big sheet of cardboard and do it with thick texture, so when you write it down, it's in big letters. Get the worst known facts and fears down on paper. 1, in cost, and secondly, in timing. The cost, because very often, as we're lying and tossing and turning in bed at night, or when the pressure's really on, it plays gymnastics with our imagination. The more I study thought technology, the more I'm convinced that the imagination is far more powerful than the will. If I was to put a 4x4 down the front here, each person in this auditorium would walk up and down with great dexterity. You would prove that you could do it. Your will has told you can do it. You know you can do it. But then let's put it 500 feet in the air. Suddenly your imagination comes into play. What if my foot slips? What if the wood breaks? What if the wind blows? And so you've got to get the worst known facts and fears down on paper in cost, in timing. Put up a poster in big letters. Take control of your attitude. Accept total responsibility. Get the facts documented. In Philippians it says, whatever things are true, the first thing, look for truth. And it goes on and says, think on these things. And so you must accept total responsibility for the situation. Well, I can remember I wrote out some checks and I found out they wouldn't be honoured, and all sorts of images came into my mind. Where would our home be taken? I'd be without a job, shame, rejection by a friend. Everybody is looking. Everybody's talking. No one will trust me again. I had a friend that went through $500,000 up in Queensland and everything was collapsing around him. I got on the phone to him and I started to talk to him. I said, Lindsay, do you feel when you walk down the street everybody's looking at you? He said, how did you know? I said, do you wake up in the middle of the night and everything gets confused and you just like to go to sleep for 12 months and wake up when it's all over? He said, that's exactly what happened. I said, have you ever thought that no one will trust you again? He said, it predominates my mind all the time. I said, well, I've got news for you, Lindsay. People can change. But what you need to do is remove the imagery. Secondly, get alone and role play past victories over difficulties. You see, everybody has failure and difficulties. I have a victory book. I have a foolscap book. It's called my victory book. I have written down there all the things that I've done well in my life. And when I feel the first bit of negativity coming in, I get that and I read it aloud. And I'm a shouting optimist within the hour. I looked at my own situation, failure, failure, failure. But I hadn't really failed in everything because there were some things that I did good and I did right, but the failure had overwhelmed it. So secondly, get alone and role play past victories over difficulties. 3, put the threat into perspective. You see, a threat perceived is more horrible than a threat performed. And all problems are magnified under pressure. Nothing is final, not even death, if you believe in eternal life. The threat is horrible compared to what? I had someone ring me up and they thought it was the end of the world. They had a problem so large. I said, no, your imagination is running riot, so while it's in good nick, let me see if we can use it a little bit differently. I said, imagine then that the worst thing that could happen to you is that your wife and your children are being taken hostages by terrorists and they're demanding a figure you cannot possibly raise. What would you class that in a score of 1 to 10? He said, that's a 10. I said, put your threat into perspective. Now, what would you put your threat in under that basis? He thought for a while and said sheepishly, maybe a 4? You see, we need to put our threats into perspective. A threat perceived is more horrible than a threat performed, and we always magnify our problems under pressure. You see, the battle might be in question, but the war is never over. I have another little card in my wallet here, and this keeps me on the track. It's very old, it's knocked about, but there it is. It tells me who I am, what I'm doing here, what my relationship is to God, what my relationship is to my family, what relationship is to my pastor, and all that I have to have done by my 80th birthday. I read that aloud every morning. That tells me who I am and what I'm doing here. I call it an affirmation sheet. And whatever threats or whatever problems you've got, if you read through that, and if you have one of these, it's very old as you can see, then you'll handle that major crisis. The 4th thing is plan a countdown. If you have a major crisis, you have 2 choices. You can let it happen or you can make it happen. If you let it happen, you're subject to circumstances. You're subject to the pressures of other people. If you make it happen, you take control. You see, you are not a slave to other people, even if you are in a major crisis. This friend of mine was going into bankruptcy. He said, the solicitors ring me up and tell me I have to be at a certain place on a certain time, and I'm trying to get a job to get some bread on the table. He said, and they're threatening me with all kinds of things. I said, Lindsay, they can't do anything without you. I said, next time they ring them up, you tell them that it's inconvenient at the time that they ask you, and you suggest a time that is suitable for you. He said, the only time that would be suitable for me would be 6 o'clock in the morning. I said, tell him that. I fixed up a system whereby he could ring me reverse charge because he had no money. He rang back. He said, they agreed. Work out a planned time frame. Don't fill up your time frame. Generally, when a major crisis comes, you're already exhausted. So don't fill up your time frame. Retain your dignity. Our second son, Graham, is a master of logic. He was renovating a house, and his father-in-law was working with him, and his father-in-law was concerned about a problem on the roof. And he kept referring to this problem on the roof, and Graham was working somewhere else, and he said, we haven't reached that problem yet. And very often we pay a price for something we haven't even reached. The fifth thing is extend the deadline. You know, if you've got a major crisis, go to the people that are involved with you in the major crisis and improve your relationship. Make friends with them. You know, very often if you make friends with someone that's involved in your major crisis, however horrible they may seem, you may find just a spark of goodness there somewhere. Reduce your expenditure and create what I call a survival budget. Extend the time frames to allow for solutions. You know, very often you can extend a time frame on the impossible. When we were in Dallas last week, a man owned 70,000 condominiums, and they weren't renting. And he had some very big mortgage payments. The banks were closing in on him. So he called a press conference, and he brought all the mortgage documents in, and there they were, stacked up all around him. He said, now you can have them if you want them, and you can take back these 70,000 condominiums, or you can give me a 12-month freeze on interest, and I'll pull the whole thing out. They had nowhere to go. They agreed. He turned his major crisis into a situation that he could handle. He extended the deadline. 6, divide and conquer. All problems are made out of component parts, and it doesn't matter how big your problem is, you can bite off small bite-sized chunks around it and reduce the whole to something smaller. And every problem you solve reduces the whole. Number 7, work on a backup plan for after the event. The Chinese have a special word for crisis. It's a 2-syllable word that says danger and opportunity. You see, so many people do not work on a backup plan for after the event. I had a friend called Craig, and he'd sold out his big mushroom company. And he went away for a holiday for 6 months. And then he came back and he said to me, Peter, he said, what will I do now? I said, Craig, why didn't you think of what you were going to do while the juices were still active? And it's the same in a major crisis. The juices are active. You're thinking sharper and faster than you ever did before in your life. And you need, at that time, to prepare a plan ready for after the event. Don't wait for the wind down to wind up. Don't let your brain juices dry up. Plan during the change, not during the rest period. Most Christians I meet around the world, their favourite verse is, come rest a while. 8, phone 6 people you know and ask them what their biggest problem was and how they handled it. Boy, that'll clear your sinuses. Get them on the phone. Better than just talking to them on the phone, invite them out to lunch. Every person in this room has had a major crisis in their life, has had a big problem. It would make an incredible book if I was to go to every single person here today and say to them, what was the biggest problem you ever had and how did you handle it? That would probably make one of the most exciting books that you could ever read. Maybe Jack might do something like that one day. You see, when you do that though, if you invite them out to lunch or you're asking them to help you in this way, don't tell them what your problem is. You see, because if you tell them what your problem is, they're going to try and... We're human, and at times we're weak, and we'll tell you what our problem is, and we'll fit it in to a solution for your problem, and you don't want that. So don't tell them what your problem is. Resist the temptation to tell them that, but take them out to lunch. Ask them, what was your biggest problem, and how did you handle it? And whatever you do, don't have a tape recorder or don't have a pencil and paper, because you see, if you let them see that you're taking notes or you've got a tape recorder on, they'll play act to the tape recorder. You see, there's 2 people, the person you see and the real person. And you've got to get the real person. And when I have a problem, I had a major one last year where people I never ever thought would tell untruths People that I never ever dreamed of would be deceptive. Just wiped out a whole thing that I was involved in. And I started to get anxious about it, and I even started to feel a little bit bitter. But then I ran a big hot bath, and I got out Fox's Book of Martyrs. And I read where they tore the Christians asunder and where they burned them alive. And when I read that, I came out. I was grateful to be alive. You see, it gives you an incredible emotional lift and puts your problems into a better perspective. You see, when you talk to people about the biggest problem they ever handled and how they handled it, you get diversity. You get all kinds of situation. But hear them out in totality. Provoke them and ask them questions. Did you really? And what did you do then? What were your thoughts at that time? How did your wife react? How did your husband handle that? What did your boss say? Did you have any problems with the bank manager? You know, ask them all these questions. But when they leave, make sure you write down everything that you learned. But of course, before they leave, you say to them, let me tell you a problem I've got at the moment. How would you handle that? Can you imagine the incredible, unbelievable information that you will have? And it will give you such an incredible emotional lift because they survived and you didn't think you could.